It was a meeting that made history. The U.S. president has wrapped up his visit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. It ended on a high note for the Trump administration, with a monumental step into North Korean territory.
I stepped into North Korea, and they say that's a very historic moment, and I think it is a historic moment. And we went over the line and turned around, and everybody was so happy. This was a big thing.
This is the first time a sitting American president has entered North Korea. President Trump called the moment an important statement and a great honor. The private talks at the DMZ went longer than expected, almost an hour. Bruce Harrison of Feature Story News is in Seoul and has more on the discussions.
The biggest takeaway, it seems, is that Trump has said that he and Kim Jong-un agreed to have both formed new teams for negotiations on the nuclear issue to achieve the goals they set out to in the Singapore summit last year, the main goal being ridding the Korean Peninsula of nuclear weapons. President Trump said U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, will still be heading his team. He also said that for North Korea, it'll be somebody that the Americans like, but he didn't name that individual. Basically, he said working level talks that will build up to another summit, perhaps, between the leaders will get underway shortly with these fresh teams. They're going to try and start over, essentially, to make this happen following the breakdown at the Hanoi summit. Still, critics abound, saying this was nothing more than a photo op. It was an opportunity for President Trump to do something first that other presidents hadn't done, but it was a substanceless meeting, and ultimately this only benefits Kim Jong-un and reinforces his position as a nuclear state. So in the long run, we don't know what the implications will be. In the short term, at least for President Moon Jae-in here in South Korea, maybe a sigh of relief. He's wanted some more progress on this issue.
That was Bruce Harrison, Seoul correspondent for Feature Story News. So just how important was this meeting? For more on the historic event, we have reached a former U.S. ambassador to South Korea. It's Christopher Hill. He joins us now from Boston. Christopher Hill, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Let's start with your reaction to watching that moment as Donald Trump stepped into North Korea.
Well, there's no question there was a lot of showmanship there. I think the president was very pleased to be the first American president to do this, certainly first American president in office. Of course, Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter have both been to North Korea at various times. So it was important to the president. The critics have said is, what's the follow-up? After all, they began a process in Singapore. Many people have pointed out that this was really very good for Kim Jong-un to be receiving the president of the United States. But the question is, what is coming next? The North Koreans have made clear that they didn't like Secretary of State Pompeo. They certainly don't like the National Security Advisor Bolton. So we'll have to see who the president has in mind in terms of spearheading these negotiations, and whether the president is prepared to go the route that the North Koreans apparently want to go, which is on a kind of painstaking step-by-step basis, as opposed to one big deal, one big historical bargain, which is what the president had in mind. So I think he's probably very pleased with this, but the really truth of it will be in the coming weeks when we see whether there's an actual negotiation, because there was absolutely no substance on what happened today.
Style over substance, you're saying there. You talk about the weeks ahead, and both sides saying that, or at least the United States saying they're going to bring a new negotiating team, and you talked about perhaps not having Mike Pompeo on that team, for example. Does bringing new people to the table really make it more likely that we could see denuclearization in Korea?
Look, I don't think it really matters as to who is on the negotiating team, but what is clear is that if President Trump wants to make any progress, he's not going to be able to do this in one fell swoop. He's going to have to go along with more of a step-by-step process, and he needs somebody who's got the patience and willingness to do that. Now, the North Koreans would like to just negotiate with him. They prefer him to anyone else they've come across, but I don't think the president should be directly involved in negotiating nuclear weapons. Look, I mean, the proposition for the American side is to explain to the North Koreans, you have a much better future without nuclear weapons than you do with nuclear weapons. And so the issue is, can you convince the North Koreans of that? So those who say North Korea will never give up their nuclear weapons, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think there is a notion out there that if you give up your nuclear weapons, you could have a better future. And the issue is to make it clear to the North Koreans that that's really the only choice they have.
Speaking to you, somebody who knows South Korea quite well and the diplomatic efforts that go on that peninsula, can Donald Trump, when he negotiates this sort of denuclearization agreement, if he begins negotiating again, is it in South Korea's best interest? Is it in the United States' best interest? How is that all part and parcel of this issue?
Well, you know, the South Koreans, like many societies, have different opinions, and many South Koreans believe you cannot trust the North Koreans as far as you can throw them. Therefore, you really shouldn't get into any kind of serious negotiation with them. But many, many South Koreans want to see a negotiation. You know, it's very easy for people in Washington and the various sort of political echo chambers you have there to talk about being tough and dropping bombs on North Korea. And the answer from the South Koreans is, well, that's easy for you to say in places like Ottawa and Washington, but how about trying to live here? And we really don't appreciate that type of belligerence. We want to see a diplomatic track. So I think the idea of the president kind of committing the U.S. administration to a negotiation going forward, I think is well received by probably most South Koreans. But clearly, the president's going to have to show some results, and he's really going to have to say to the North Koreans, look, we have a lot of options for dealing with this, but we don't have the option of walking away and claiming that it's okay for you to have nuclear weapons. I think the U.S. has been pretty clear that North Korea is going to have to give up their nuclear weapons. So we have to see if the North Koreans will finally accept that proposition. I negotiated with them for 4 years as part of a 6-party process. Believe me, it was no fun at all. You think you get a deal, and the next day they kind of walk it back on you. So it's a very, very painstaking process.